Hello everybody, Aimer back with another Mission Impossible episode review. This time we're doing the Revival series, Season 2, Episode 12, which is called Cargo Cult. So this one starts out in a place called New Belgium at a work camp where a couple of guys discuss the fact that they have a bunch of corpses hidden in a truck. A health inspector has come by, telling one of the men named Otagi that he's taken water samples from a nearby gold mine and found ridiculously high levels of cyanide. Otagi's man clears the canteen tent and holds the inspector's arms while Otagi forces the poisoned water down his throat. Jim goes to a cathedral and uses spy speak with an organist to get his disc player. The mission: the jungles of New Belgium allowed the Stone Age tribes there to live in relative peace until gold was discovered recently, and the villagers are now being poisoned due to the wanton and unsafe use of cyanide. The IMF must stop what the voice on tape calls this genocide. We get an apartment scene where we learn that Michael Otagi is the commissioner of his area and is almost finished building a bridge to get heavy equipment across a gorge to speed up the mining process. Max has joined Otagi's crew for reconnaissance and learned that the villagers worship a volcano god called Obi-Katu, which is probably what's being used to force them to continue to work the mines somehow. Shannon and Nicholas will go in as volcanologists, while Jim will arrive as a broker to allow the workers to exchange their gold for cash, with Grant as his bodyguard. At Otagi's camp, Max passes the time by winning arm wrestling matches, and Jim and Grant arrive with the men lining up to cash out. The men get uptight at the unfavorable exchange rate, but Grant's submachine gun forces them to calm down a bit. Nicholas and Shannon arrive, and given the tension and raging hormones around the all-male work camp, Jim tells Max to take care of Shannon, and he tries, but it sure seems like Grant's gun is the only thing that protects her from some serious unpleasantness. Otagi looks at Nicholas's papers and tells Max to take the two scientists across the bridge. Jim wonders why everything seems to be just a bit too easy. And when the other three get across the bridge, they're accosted by a group of spear-wielding warriors who take them to their village, chanting Rega. A masked figure appears as Rega from what appears to be an airplane, telling the villagers they've done well, and he will ask for the grace of their father Obi-Katu, getting them to put the three agents in a bamboo cell. When they do, Rega unmasks and tells him that he's a geologist who has seized a golden opportunity, as he describes it. Nicholas figures that the tribe adopted a cargo cult mentality, that's where the episode's name comes from, believing that Rega's crash plan was a sign from above. So of course he's a god and they'll do anything he tells them to. The villagers play with the team's radios, but of course there's no messages, indicating to Jim that something isn't right. He and Grant try to get Otagi to take them across the bridge, saying they want to invest in his business, but he turns them down. They find a storage unit with Otagi's explosives and loads of cyanide. Otagi arrives and meets with Regir at the mining site, where villagers cough and wheeze because of the heavy poison they're breathing. Otagi tells his man to add more cyanide to the solutions they're using to speed up production, and the full extent of the shenanigans are revealed. Rega is actually Donald Regir, who crashed near the village and became a deity, and formulated the plan with Otagi to use the villagers to mine the gold. Regir says his hold over the villagers is becoming more tenuous because of all the death, and he's running out of men to work the mine. But the callous Otagi doesn't care. He tells him to use women and children if he has to, and Otagi reminds him that now he has the IMF agents to sacrifice in a ceremony to placate Obi-Katu if he has to. And their loss can easily be explained as them just getting lost in the unforgiving jungle. Regir uses some equipment in his plane and some well-placed speakers to simulate the rumbling of the volcano, and the sound travels far enough that Jim and Grant can hear it, figuring that something is very wrong since they still can't reach the others. Meanwhile, the others are taken out of their cell by Regir, who explains that he's decided to give Max and Nicholas to the volcano god as a sacrifice, with the villagers strapping them to propellers, and promises that Shannon will be quite safe as his consort goddess to take up residence in his plane temple, implying that Obi-Katu might want grandchildren, and pawing at her lasciviously. Side note here, were I granted the opportunity to keep Jane Badler as my consort in this type of situation, well, I gotta tell you, I'd probably take it too. Even a grubby looking Jane is totally hot. Anyway, Grant stows away on Otagi's truck when he returns for another supply pickup, which gets him across the bridge and allows him to have a look at what's going on at the mining site and the village. He's able to get close enough to the plane to overhear Regir talking to Shannon about what's happened, and finds the IMS van, which contains a tranquilizer gun. He tracks the villagers up towards the volcano. Grant uses the gun's laser to send a message in Morse code, telling Max and Nicholas to aim their fingers at the villagers, and Grant knocks a few of them out with the tranquilizer darts, causing them to flee. Jim is somehow able to join the others and tells them that they'll have to somehow continue to force the wedge between the villagers and Regir. The men go to commandeer some of Otagi's explosives, and when Regir leaves the plane to check on the returning villagers and their unconscious warriors, Shannon is able to use the plane's radio to contact Jim and tell him to hurry things up. Regir returns and breaks it up, calling Otagi to arrange a meeting and telling him that they're in trouble, as Max and Nicholas have escaped the wrath of Obi-Katu. Otagi spots Jim, who has somehow returned without the others, and correctly realizes that he's probably behind it, telling Regir to declare Shannon a witch and cast her out to regain control of the situation. While the others set up near the village, Jim tries to get Otagi to take him back across by saying he wants to finance the mining operation, but needs to see it himself first. Otagi says he'll be glad to take him across, but says that Jim will remain there, along with the sacrificial witch and his other compatriots. Regir publicly declares Shannon a witch, allowing Nicholas to get into the plane and Grant to get to the IMF van to get some equipment. Otagi arrives with white-haired sorcerer Jim as another sacrificial gift to Obi-Katu, so as to remove the sickness spell that plagues the villagers. The tranquilizer wears off and Jim goes through a show of resurrecting the fallen warriors. Regir continues to urge the villagers to kill them, but Nicholas starts up the rumbling, and Grant sets off some explosions around the volcano, frightening everyone, including the guys in the work camp. Grant then sets up a laser projection of his face above the volcano and speaks as Obi-Katu, ordering the villagers to release the newcomers and cast out Regir as a false prophet. Otagi's man pulls out his gun and prepares to shoot, but gets impaled by a villager's spear, as they now, of course, believe that Jim is Obi-Katu's real messenger. The villagers allow the IMF to leave and surround Otagi and Regir menacingly. Otagi picks up the gun, shoots a couple of the warriors, allowing the two of them to leave in his truck. The IMF return and pick Max up after he sets up a timing device in the storage unit, which causes the bridge to explode as Otagi's truck returns, and the IMF leave them to the unforgiving jungle. Mission accomplished. I'm going to save my grade for the end of the discussion on this one. I think it's probably pretty clear from the recap and the way I spoke about it and my body language and whatnot. You probably already know that the grade is not going to be great. But let me talk this one through. I found it kind of interesting. I don't know whether I want to say that it's good. But I did find it interesting that the IMF agents throughout the episode wear like very bright colored shirts. That's something that struck me in watching this again, and that's a really odd thing for me to notice. But it really does stand out because it's in such opposition to the dingy colors that are worn by Regir, the villagers, even the guys in the work camp. You know, everything is really, really dingy, but the IMF, you know, at least with their clothing, stands out a little bit. I guess there's kind of some symbolism there, which I don't fully comprehend, but it's really, really noticeable. And it's the one thing that kind of struck me about this. I've commented throughout the series that visually, visually this series is pretty good. I will grant that, given the technology that was available at the time. And I will say that I think at least the production crew decided that this not good script, let's just call it out for what it is. This is not a good episode. It's not a good script, but at least the production crew decided to try and make the best of it with wardrobe and some of the effects and that sort of thing. They're very, very cheesy. The effects are really, really cheesy, and I don't give the writers or producers a lot of credit for the type of gadgetry that's used in this episode. It's pretty rudimentary, but again, with what they had to work with, what exactly do you expect? And you'll hear me say that more as we go along. Let's just talk about the bad. This is probably the most culturally tone deaf script that is imaginable for a show like this. I don't really know what else to say. The whole way this, quote unquote, primitive Stone Age tribe, even just the concept of it is treated, is, I really don't have an adjective to describe it. Some of the villagers, the actors playing the villagers, are obviously Caucasian, and I just don't get what, like how did somebody think that this was a good idea? The thought that occurred to me was, when you look at shows like, let's say, Gilligan's Island, going back, half a century, that show had a lot of episodes where the castaways had to deal with quote unquote savages, and that was also very, very culturally tone deaf. We're talking about the 1960s. Things were obviously very, very different then, just as back in the 80s and 90s things are very different than they are now. But I would say that even Gilligan's Island had more realistic quote unquote savages than these villagers that we saw here. It's tough for me to even use words like that. But again, we're talking about a premise and a plot and a story that is just so ridiculous. Speaking of ridiculous, the dialogue in the episode, I was going to call it out as being kind of silly and ridiculous. But it's not the usual type of silly and ridiculous dialogue. It's not the usual cabbaging dialogue. It really strikes me as the fact that, we are in again, I keep using the word ridiculous. We're in such a ridiculous situation. Of course you're going to have ridiculous dialogue. What exactly do you expect? Trying to get away from that, I don't want to keep repeating myself over and over again. So let me get to some specifics here. First of all, we have an apartment scene that basically tells us everything about the IMF plan. What they're going to do, who they're going to go in as, and all of that kind of thing. In this particular case, I've commented about this in some other episodes where we get exposition during the apartment scene, and oftentimes it's not as bad. It's not that bad. It's just to kind of set things up. In this particular case, this is because the plot is really, really thin, and there really is not even a sliver of foundation for why the IMF is going in here, rather than there be some kind of diplomatic or political way to achieve whatever goal apparently the U.S. government wants to achieve here. Why they're even getting involved, it just doesn't make it. And, that's a recurring theme, as you probably figured out by now. Another thing specifically that I found was bad is this whole concept of the bridge that is being built. It starts out as a plot device. The bridge is really the thing that the IMF needs to prevent from being completed. It has to be destroyed. It's kind of the thing that's causing the whole problem here. And I would have expected it to be treated with some more seriousness. Instead of being used as a proper plot device, it really is exactly the opposite. The whole point of it is it's difficult to cross. You can't really get across it right now. Heavy machinery can't cross it. Right now it's just a bridge where, sometimes a truck can get over. It's at least wide enough for that. And the problem is that, Otagi and his men are always watching it, so it's not just a matter of driving across, you'll be seen. But then, about halfway through the episode, after the volcano rescue, Grant radios Jim and says, "We'll come and pick you up at the bridge." Wait a minute. I thought the whole premise of the episode was that the bridge, you can't cross it easily. If you can do it all of a sudden, what is the point of this episode? You change the premise. You change it in mid episode. What are you doing here? I don't get it. And then it's even furthermore. Suddenly, after Jim joins the others and they scope out the volcano and they make their plan, suddenly Jim is back across, and Otagi spots him, and they have this meeting back at his storage unit, and Jim is just there without the others. How did that happen? Did they kind of drive him back to the edge, and he kind of walked across really, really carefully? It makes this episode impossible to judge using a lot of the usual methodology that I do when I kind of dissect it and critique it. I can't even judge this one on the basis of degree of difficulty, especially when you're going to change the rules of the episode, so to speak, right in the middle of the episode. That really just kind of takes it into a whole different kind of zone. And I really don't know what to do about that. Another thing that is kind of tough to talk about here is the villains. When I talk about villains, I try to kind of use them, as you know, if you've been watching these reviews, talking about the kisses of death, lameness, schmuckery, and if a villain is unengaging. Those are really the three big turnoffs. In this case, the villains are really lame. When you have an episode like this, I don't see how you can make non-lame villains. That's just really not possible. I would say that Regir as a villain is quite the schmuck. By the way, you probably recognize him. If you do, he's Adrian Wright, is the actor, and he was in the season 1 episode Condemned. He was Yusuf Hamidou, the antagonist in that one. Regir, despite his bluster, is really not able to think on his feet. He needs Otagi to kind of tell him what to do. At least Otagi, who's played by Lani John Tupu, who is from New Zealand and is of Samoan descent, so at least he kind of looks the part here. He shows that competence. He's certainly not the worst villain ever, but he's really the driving force in this episode as far as antagonism goes. I was prepared to comment about this episode suffering from the problem that I pointed out in many episodes, where you have multiple antagonists. Two guys, usually men, who are working together towards a common goal, but they have kind of differing, motivations, which is a problem in many, many episodes. Here it's kind of different. This might actually be the first episode as such where there's multiple antagonists, but they kind of don't distract from our dislike for each other. They actually have kind of a synergy going, which kind of amplifies our dislike of them. I use the word dislike specifically because it's not really hatred or anything like that in terms of, being unengaging, that sort of thing. There is a little bit of kind of like go away heat that I feel with these guys. As I said, they're not unengaging, but they're really thoroughly unlikable in a way that even, Otagi's ruthlessness, saying, use the women and children, I don't care, I want my gold, I don't care what I have to do to get it, it doesn't really make him any more impressive. And I can't really put my finger on why. I think it's just a vibe of the lameness of the whole premise of the episode. I see it as being a little bit of the same problem as we had a few episodes ago in the episode The Führer's Children. In that one, I commented that a big problem for me in that episode was the fact that I wanted to, disengage from those villains. That's how I felt. But given the premise of that episode, it's impossible to be completely apathetic to those villains because they were literal Nazis. Somehow or other, even though this is a plot where you can argue, at least the word here is used, that there's being a genocide of this, Stone Age village tribe. Somehow or other, it doesn't quite come across the same way. And it poses an interesting kind of conundrum to me. I can't be completely apathetic to it for the same kind of reasons. There's kind of a level of evil thing there, and it just really makes it tough to deal with. It seems to me like the writers are trying to do some kind of, progress is bad message at some level, kind of like, the one of the themes of the Lord of the Rings about how things were better when there wasn't so much technology and all of that kind of stuff. Whatever, that's neither here nor there, I suppose. I just thought I'd point it out. This is designed to be anvilicious in a way, but I could be polite and say that it doesn't hit the mark. I think it completely misses the mark. I think that there was a desire on the part of the authors to make it anvilicious, but the anvil is like in a whole other time zone, frankly. It reminds me a lot of the Führer's Children in that way. I think the writers were trying to set up these villains as being a special kind of evil, much like Albert Salmi's character, Kester, in that episode was. But it just doesn't hit. It doesn't click in terms of creating that special kind of evil. At least it doesn't for me. Another thing that really bothered me in this one is the way that Shannon is really kind of treated almost as an object in this one. She is at constant risk of being raped. Right at the beginning, when she shows up at the work camp, there's a point there where there's a couple of guys who are actually putting her up on a table, and I actually had forgotten about that when I went back and watched this, and I was just like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And then, of course, there's the whole thing with Regir basically, molesting her and pawing at her inside his plane. And this one reminds me, I can't really think of a specific callback for this episode, so I'll just point these out from the revival itself. If you remember what happened last season in The Devils, where Shannon was basically knocked out and undressed and molested by these, satanic, followers of Lord Holman. And I commented on how disturbing that was. And the same thing is going on here. Not that the other agents get to do a whole heck of a lot in this episode that is impressive. Nicholas and Max do a couple of things, but it's really Grant setting up the equipment and Jim, kind of working Otagi that drives most of that action. But it's just bizarre the way that Shannon's character is treated in this one. And it actually happens a lot, I think, more than I've realized. But War Games from earlier this season, that was also another one where that basically became Shannon's lot in the episode. And that's not good. Just a final note, I have to say it because, I've talked about, science and especially chemistry. When the writers don't get it right, it really, really bugs me. Grant comments about cyanide ionizing when it explodes. And to explain what's going to happen when the storage unit basically blows up after the IMF set up their timing device. That's not true. Sodium cyanide, if you subject it to those kind of conditions, I didn't even really need to go refer back to my high school or college chemistry for that. It becomes hydrogen cyanide. It becomes a gas, and it is even more deadly, and even worse, it's quite flammable. So this is just dumb the whole way through. Absolutely the worst thing the IMF could have done was to cause that storage unit to explode. because literally, in the real world, they would be putting themselves at risk of death or serious cyanide poisoning just from being near it. Also, as just kind of something that is wrong from a chemical standpoint, as a gas, or cyanide is very, very dangerous, of course. Drinking water with sodium cyanide in it, as was portrayed in the opening scene with the poor inspector that Otagi forces the tainted water down his throat. Yeah, that's not healthy, okay, and that would be quite dangerous. But again, realistically, what would happen if something like that happened to you, to an adult human? It won't cause you to go into convulsions in seconds the way that the inspector did. It didn't look like he was completely dead because he was moving a little bit, but that would not happen. It would, even in a best case scenario, if you're considering, for effect, best, I'm using the word kind of loosely, would take at least a good 15 to 30 minutes. And drinking that amount of water, even with a high cyanide content, would not kill you. It would injure you, and you would probably be much the worse for wear if you didn't get medical attention pretty quickly, but it wouldn't kill you. You would suffer, and you'd be sick for a while, but it would not kill you. Anyway, let me just get that. So to bring this to a close, my grade for this one, I was prepared to give this one an F based on my recollection of it and how silly and ridiculous it was. I've used those words a lot. I'm going to give this one a grudging D minus, right on the border of F. If you were grading it, and if let's say F was 49 or less on a scale of 1 to 100, and the D mark was like a 51 going up to 59, and 51 would be considered a D minus in that range, I'd put this kind of right at the 50 or the 49. That's where it belongs. I had to think about it, and I had to say to myself, is this worse or better than The Devils from last season? Which I hope the entire fandom agrees was just a colossal embarrassment. I thought about it and I said to myself that, you know what? This is a little bit better. Maybe I have to think about it a little bit more. But my initial thought is one of the big problems, or lots of problems, with the Devils episode was that the IMF was equally as stupid as the villains. And not for any reason other than maybe vibes that they were getting from the villains. But the IMF was just colossally moronic at multiple stages of that episode. Here, the foolish premise is what causes the IMF to have to do the ridiculous stuff that they do. They're just kind of following along for the purposes of the plot. It's not because of their own silliness and foolishness as it was in The Devil. So that's why I'm going to say this is just a teeny tiny smidge above that. But boy, it really seems like the writers were trying hard to make this equally as bad. That's the feel that I get. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that because I think I've given this episode more attention than it deserves, frankly. Thank you guys as always for watching. Please like this review video. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and please leave your comments about this and other episodes. What do you think? Is this worse or better than The Devils? I can understand if you think that this is worse, but I'd like to hear why. Maybe there's something that I'm missing, and comments have changed my mind before, and I'm really looking forward to hearing those from you about this and other episodes. Thank you guys again, and I'll see you next time.